Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're talking adventures in the Forgotten Realms and going over all of the new additions we'll be adding to our Unrestricted Cube. If this is your first time joining us for an update video, I'll be explaining why we're interested in each new addition, as well as what the cut was for each card. If you like what you see and you want to come try out the cube for yourself, there will be links to our Discord community in the description below, and you can always subscribe to this channel for more content like this. Also, if you want a more in-depth look at our opinions on the set, check out the latest episode of our podcast, The Deep Dive, where we just finished our cube set review for the new cards. Alright, without further ado, let's talk D&D and Magic. Let's kick off the update with one of the best cards in the set, Icing Death Frost Tyrant. It's a 4/3 flyer for 4 with Vigilance that dies into an equipment token that can tap down blockers when the equipped creature attacks. The baseline stats on this dragon are already priced to move, and the equipment it drops upon death is going to turn any remaining creatures into hard-to-block threats. In other words, it's a must-answer threat that, when answered, turns your other creatures into additional must-answer threats. We expect this to join the ranks of the amazing aggressive white creatures we've been getting for the last couple sets. It always pains us to remove a Dominaria card from the queue, but Shalai's time has come, as she's been outclassed with a lot of recent additions. Shalai's never been a terrible card, but she's a little less necessary for most decks than other options we have available, and she's felt like a bit of a filler card as of late. Speaking of great aggressive white creatures, Loyal Warhound was an unexpected surprise from the set and slots perfectly into the cube. A 3/1 body with potential upside is always welcome for aggro decks, even if Vigilance isn't the most exciting keyword. You'll miss out on the bonus planes a fair amount of the time, but when you do manage to proc the ability, it's gonna feel great. White aggro decks often try to skimp on lands, and they also benefit from incidental deck thinning, so filtering a free land out of your deck can help hit crucial land drops and improve the quality of your later draws, and Loyal Warhound doesn't ask you to do anything fancy for this upside. We trimmed Leonin Warleader as a way to lower White's curve a little bit, and if I'm being honest, I've never been a big fan of this card. I don't put a lot of stock in creatures that have to survive and attack to reach their potential, but even I have to admit Warleader can carry a game on its back. Still, we needed to trim an expensive card from the list, and Warleader's the one we landed on. That and it just feels appropriate to cut a cat for a dog. Sorry, not sorry. Wizards has definitely been going out of their way to buff equipment lately, and Dancing Sword feels like one such recipient of this trend. It's a 2-mana equipment that gives +2/+1 and has a cheap equip cost of just 1 to equip. That's already reasonably statted, but equipment needs a little more than that to be cube-worthy. Thankfully, Dancing Sword has an additional ability to become a 2/1 flyer when the equipped creature dies. +2/+1 is enough of a stat boost that the opponents can't just ignore your creatures, and spotting you a free 2/1 flyer when your opponent does answer your threat is some real upside. It feels perhaps a tad weaker than Maul of the Skyclave, but should be a nice addition regardless. We're cutting Finale of Glory, another card that feels overshadowed by other cards doing much the same thing. Starnheim Unleashed blows Finale out of the water, and if you're looking to play the Mirari's Wake big mana deck, you can usually pick up March of the Multitudes. Finale wasn't drafted often, and it's a pretty easy cut to make room for a cheaper card. I was ready to dismiss Guardian of Faith with my initial pass through the set, but Chris and Theo sold me on it just enough to give it a second look. It's certainly a step below the premium 3-drops in white, cards like Elite Spellbinder and Skyclave Apparition, but perhaps not by too much. My initial read of this card was that it's a defensive measure to protect your aggro board state from a sweeper, but it was pointed out to me that Guardian of Faith has some merit on offense as well. See, the Phazon ability lets you pick and choose which creatures you want to blink out for the turn, so you're free to attack pretty indiscriminately into a board of blockers, and once your opponent's lined up blocks, you can save any of your creatures that you want to. As a defensive measure against sweepers, this is probably worse than Unbreakable Formation, but the Guardian does have a fail case of being a 3-power beater that you can always cast and start attacking with. I'm not 100% sold on it, but it deserves a shot, and it's likely better than some of the medium 3-drops we still have hanging around, namely Hanged Executioner. Executioner's fine, but just fine, and even with the blue-white blink support in the cube, it's a less than ideal creature for that style of deck. It's only appropriate that we also kick off blue with a big flashy mythic rare dragon, in this case Imrith Desert Doom. Maybe I'm overvaluing this card, or maybe I'm just getting Dragon Lord Ojutai vibes here, but I'm pretty excited to try this out. Ward 4 is not exactly hexproof, but it's pretty damn close, which means Imrith is likely to stick around until your next turn when it hits the board. Once you untap, you can back it up with counter magic and get the card advantage train rolling. I don't anticipate you're drawing more than one card very often with the combat trigger, but you don't need to be drawing more than one card per hit to justify this card in your deck. Now, I do recognize that Imrith's vulnerable while it's attacking, but it's a pretty gnarly 5/5 that dodges a lot of removal anyway. We cut Thrix the Sudden Storm to make room, which might be wrong. Thrix is actually better suited for a wider variety of blue decks, namely the control decks that want to play at instant speed, but Imrith might fill those shoes just as well, while also being a great top-end threat for Izzet or Simic decks. I'm perhaps a tad less excited for Grazilex than Imrith, but Grazilex was interesting enough that we're going to test it out. You cap out at usually only one card per combat, but even so that feels like a nice addition to the blue-based tempo decks. The confusing part is the first ability, which lets you bounce your blocked attackers back to your hand, so your creatures never really die on offense. That is upside, but it's a tempo hit when you have to do that, and it doesn't feel like you're going to be able to turn that into an advantage that often. All in all, we're going to see how Grazilex performs. I don't have any particular expectations about this one. We cut Baron, Tolarian Archmage to make room. First off, Baron and Grazilex are both double blue to cast, so there's a clean swap there. Second, and more importantly, Baron has felt like a lesser version of Exclusion Mage, which is bizarre to say given that Baron's ability is strictly better than Exclusion Mage's. Our experience tells us that you usually want the single blue pip Exclusion Mage more often, even if Baron seems to have higher upside. You Find the Villain's Lair is one of the weirdly named D&D inspired cards that we're testing out this time around. This one in particular is a modal counterspell / card filtering instant, and it strikes me as a dead average cancel variant. It's similar in function to Neutralize and Supreme Will in that it's essentially a 3-mana counterspell that has an alternative mode of shaping up your hand. Notably, when you cast the Faithless Looten mode on this card, you're actually down a card, and when you cast the counterspell half, you're just canceling a spell. Neither mode is very strong, but you do get both modes in one card, which bumps its playability up a decent amount. My suspicion is that this will be one of our weaker counterspells, but we already had Rewind around, which has been a less than stellar counterspell. Occasionally you get to jam Rewind into a spell and follow up with a draw spell, but more often than not, Rewind just ends up being an expensive counterspell that's fairly easy to play around, and we could stand to replace it with a slightly more versatile card. Next up is something Chris and I have been itching to try out for a while now, that card being Drakehaven. Over the last couple sets, we've picked up a number of card filtering tools and ways to discard cards for value, enough so that it feels like now's a great time to test out Drakehaven. It might not pan out, but it feels like an interesting build around that pays you off for filling your deck full of looting and rummaging style effects like Faithless Looting, Prismari Command, Merfolk Looter, and Conspiracy Theorist, to name a few. The cut was Cavalier of Gales. Again, this isn't a direct one-for-one swap. Rather, we knew we wanted to address Blue's clunkiness at the top end of the curve by nixing a 5-drop creature. Cavalier is one of those awkward cards that reads like an absolute bomb of a creature, but doesn't meet that expectation in actual gameplay. It's hard to say why that is, but it's been clear for a while that Cavalier isn't quite up to our standards for the cube. Another concern we want to address with some of our changes is the fact that aggro has been top dog for a couple seasons now, basically ever since Kaldheim was released, and we need to even the playing field a little bit. Illyrios Enraptured is an attempt to do so, since it provides a fantastic speed bump against all-in aggressive decks. You're virtually guaranteed a 2-for-1 against aggro decks when you resolve Illyrios, and he plays well in the secondary blue-white blink deck. It's not the most exciting card, but it's here to serve a specific purpose. I originally sang the praises of Cosima when it was first released, and while I maintain that this is a great card to have in certain matchups, I've cooled a bit on thinking it's a slam dunk card for the cube. In reality, Cosima is unnecessarily confusing and difficult to play, and really only shines in the control versus control mirrors, which don't come up too often. There's a world where Cosima comes back to the cube, but she's out voyaging for now. Our players probably know by now that I loathe control magic effects, so it's a bit counterintuitive that we'd add another to the cube without cutting one. That being said, Entrancing Melody is coming back in as a control magic that has game against low curve creature decks, namely the Aggro Menace. I'm a little worried that this is overcompensating for the problem, and blue decks will just have too many control magic variants to run over all style of creature decks, but Entrancing Melody is a fair bit weaker than Confiscation Coup and Agent of Treachery, and is really only at its best against aggro decks. To make room, we cut Baral's Expertise, which is another expensive interactive piece that just sits a bit too high up on the curve for us to be comfortable with. Finally, for blue, to further supplement the intended Drakehaven deck, we're going to give Boon of the Wishgiver a whirl in the Unrestricted Cube. It's a Peasant all-star for sure, but Unrestricted Cube has better card draw options. Still, resolving a draw 4 is backbreaking against most opponents, and cycling for a single mana is a generous safety valve on this style of card. At face value, Boon is a middle-of-the-road draw spell, but it fits with some of our new additions well enough to warrant a spot. Namely, it interacts favorably with Drakehaven and Mizzix's Mastery, which we'll get to later. The cut was Omen of the Sea, a pretty solid cantrip when all is said and done, but not a necessary one. I have nothing bad to say about the blue Omen, we just think a cheap cycler with a powerful late-game effect serves our purposes a bit better at the moment. Black's going to get a little bit of new and a little bit of old, with our first card being the big splashy mythic rare dragon from the set, Ebondeath Dracolich. It's a bit difficult to evaluate, but a 4-mana flyer with 5 power is a real threat no matter how you look at it, even if it's a bit frail on the back end. Ebondeath falls somewhere between the black aggro decks, the aristocrats decks, and the graveyard value decks, and that much crossover means it's likely to make a splash somewhere. We even speculate that Ebondeath has a place as a finisher for Dimir control decks, where you can combine the Dracolich's recursive ability with numerous Doomblade style effects in the late game. Sadly, it's finally time to let go of Phyrexian Obliterator. It's an iconic card and a poster child for what historic anthologies have to offer on Arena, but it's also not a necessity for the cube. Black Devotion isn't a fully supported archetype, and sure, Obliterator pulls its weight in mono-black aggro decks, but it feels like its spot can better serve the cube with a card that fits more than one narrow, rarely drafted deck. I fully expect our next edition to be a powerhouse for Peasant Cube, but we've got our eye on it for Unrestricted Cube as well. Warlock class is coming in as another attempt to bolster graveyard decks, since the second level is essentially Ransack the Lab, or Strategic Planning, attached to a permanent. Black really craves this sort of ability, and there aren't many cheap playable versions for the Unrestricted Cube. The other levels help to deal out additional damage throughout the course of the game, with level 3 being a potential finisher should the game drag out long enough. Honestly, Warlock class might prove too cumbersome or weak for the cube, but it fills a role that we've been struggling to fill for a while. Platecrafter was removed for the time being, and while this might not end up being a permanent change, we've got a wide enough variety of good 3-drop creatures in black that we could stand to remove one for something a little bit more speculative. Power Word Kill is perhaps the most immediate staple addition to Cube from the entire set. It joins the ranks of all the other top-tier Doomblade variants and slots in very nicely as one of, if not the best, variants among those. Naturally, your Power Word Kill will brick on hitting some crucial creatures, and it'll be tedious when that happens, but that's what we come to expect from this style of removal spell. A kill spell that only kills 80 to 85% of your opponent's creatures for 2 mana is still fantastic, even if the other 15 to 20% are creatures that desperately need to be killed. We sub this in over Eliminate, with Eliminate's real claim to fame being that it can take care of early game planeswalkers like 3-mana Chandra or Narset. There really aren't enough of those to demand a need for Eliminate over a generally better removal spell. In our set review for the Deep Dive podcast, we came to the conclusion that if you flipped a coin to determine whether you would be playing Check for Traps or Agonizing Remorse, assuming you only wanted one, the result really wouldn't make much of a difference. The upsides and downsides of each are minor at best. Check for Traps has the upside that your opponent sometimes loses the life instead of you, whereas Agonizing Remorse has the upside of sniping a card from a graveyard in the off chance that you have nothing worth taking from the opponent's hand. We can quibble over the differences, but our conclusion boiled down to us wanting to cut back on incidental graveyard hate in an attempt to give the graveyard-based decks a little bit more room to breathe, and while cutting Agonizing Remorse is unlikely to make a noticeable difference, it was an easy and likely unimportant swap between the two cards. Next up is a Jumpstart card that caught our attention during some of the recent editions of the Arena Cube. Witch of the Moors asks that you gain life in order to work, and life gain is not a fully supported theme in the Unrestricted Cube, but there are enough incidental ways to proc the ability that it seems worth a try. A single instance of gain in life gives you an Edict and a Raise Dead, all stapled to a perfectly serviceable 4/4 Death Touch. There's a small chance it'll end up being a flop without the right support, but we've got high hopes for this one. With that, it's finally time to let go of Gary. Grey Merchant has never really been at its best in the Unrestricted Cube. As we already mentioned with Phyrexian Obliterator, it suggests the existence of a mono-black devotion deck that we're not fully interested in supporting, and it's certainly a notch below the other 5 drops in black. Don't worry though, you can still get plenty of Gary action in the Peasant Cube. We've mentioned already how aggro decks have been dominating our meta recently, so we're opting to bring Massacre Worm back in for the time being. We were never in love with Massacre Worm, but it feels like a tool at our disposal for exactly these types of situations, and gives late game black decks a way to punish the go wide decks in the environment aside from the typical sweepers. I imagine we'll probably pull the worm back out once things have evened out a bit. We sacrificed a Burnin' Rune Demon for this spot. It's a card that's been somewhat interesting, but even with our endeavors to strengthen the graveyard decks, it's just more important to make sure black decks as a whole have the tools to combat aggro decks, so Massacre Worm feels like a better use of the slot for the time being, especially given that Massacre Worm is a perfectly fine reanimation target for the decks that would be interested in Burnin' Rune Demon anyway. We weren't jazzed about Eradicator Valkyrie, or Bad Rankle as Chris likes to call it, when Kaldheim was released. And while we don't consider this a top-end playable, it feels like it's got a good supporting cast to warrant a test run. The life gain helps with aggro decks I've been harping on, and it seems like a nice package deal to bring in alongside the Witch of the Moors. Hexproof from Planeswalkers might as well be throwaway text, although it does stop your opponent from interacting with some of the more powerful Planeswalkers like 4-mana Chandra, 5-mana Teferi, and 5-mana Ashiok. Valkyrie might not be enough, but it's not embarrassing by any stretch. Doom Whisperer, however, has, up until now, been a mainstay in the cube, and has consistently underperformed expectations. I'm noticing a bit of a theme here. There's something about giant 5-mana creatures that's making them less appealing than you'd guess. We talked about Cavalier of Gales already, but Doom Whisperer is in the same boat. All signs point to this being a fantastic card, but it's just not. Maybe the answers are too efficient, or maybe you don't get enough immediate value when you tap out for it. Whatever the case, it's been an underperformer during its entire stay, and it's about time we cut it. Duress finally makes an appearance in the Unrestricted Cube. Look, Duress isn't flashy, but it's good, even better than you'd think in a cube environment. Literally every deck plays some sort of non-creature spell, and Duress lets you nab a pivotal game piece on the cheap with no real downside. It's always been cube-worthy, and we're finally bringing it in. On the other hand, Finale of Eternity has been less than cube-worthy. It's not that it's bad per se, it's more that it's just hyper-specific which matchups it excels in. As a sweeper, it's just a second-rate Languish or Crux of Fate, and if we really wanted a small ball black sweeper, we'd play an Infest variant like Cry of the Carnarium. Perhaps we should be doing that anyway, but regardless, Finale of Eternity is not the answer to aggro that we wanted it to be. Finally, for black, we're bringing back Blacklance Paragon. It was always a solid card, giving black aggro decks a serviceable 2-mana, 3-power creature, while also giving black control decks a flash threat that functions as a combat trick to some extent. We cut it a little while back to try out Dream Devourer, and while I had high hopes for Dream Devourer, it definitely fell short. We anticipated that some big mana black decks could use the Devourer as a form of mana ramp, but it turns out that you don't have all the time in the world to be spending your mana on just foretelling cards, even if they come down a few turns earlier. The dream was to foretell cards like Professor Onyx or Ugin the Spirit Dragon and pop them out a full 2 turns earlier, but it turns out if you're playing powerful control finishers, you can just do better than an 0-3 for 2. Red didn't fare quite as well as the other colors, but at least we get to talk about yet another flashy mythic rare dragon here. Honestly, Inferno of the Star Mounts probably isn't necessary. It kind of goes against our desire to lower the curve since we'll actually be cutting Goldspan Dragon for it, but it seems like it's worth testing as a top-end red creature for Gruul ramp decks. It's very likely that Inferno of the Star Mounts can flat out kill your opponent in 2 combat phases, and you almost always get the first hit in. Red 6-drops have traditionally missed the mark in our cube, but most of those didn't have haste, and this dragon comes out the gate swinging. Maybe it ends up being not worth it, but we'll see. As for Goldspan Dragon, I have nothing bad to say about the card. It's an excellent creature with an excellent ability, but even so, it's a bit too samey next to Glorybringer and this new dragon. Don't be shocked though if we find that the jump in Red's curve is a bit too much and end up swapping this back around. Flameskull is a bit more interesting. It's a persistent flyer that can come back for another go anytime it dies, or you can swap it out for a different card if you see fit to do so. It seems like a nuisance to play against, but it really only excels in aggro. The fact that it can't block hurts its chances of actually dying and triggering, but your opponent can't exactly ignore a 3-power flyer forever either, so there's a good chance it's hit in the bin at some point. You can also facilitate the death trigger on your own in some Rakdos Sacrifice decks, although those decks are capable of stronger plays. It's a unique card and a solid addition to aggro without being completely overwhelming, right where we want to be at the moment. I'd say it's about the same power level as Spiteful Prankster, another great creature in both aggro and sacrifice decks. As far as Aristocrats decks go, it's not entirely necessary due to the presence of Judith and Blood Artist, although Spiteful Prankster has merit in Boros aggro as well. Prankster's probably not down and out forever, we're just paving way for something new here. Meteor Swarm stood out as a point of controversy between members of our community. Some of us pegged it as a powerful sweeper-like effect that might actually be better than cards like Storm's Wrath, and others fell a bit short, saying that the triple red and the inability to sweep an entire board of tokens takes away from its appeal. Both are valid arguments, but we feel that the baseline of 4 mana to kill virtually anything, or 5 mana to kill 2 creatures, is a good starting point. Red doesn't get many ways to clear a large blocker, and for all of its faults, Meteor Swarm fills a noticeable gap for Red. Storm's Wrath always felt like a necessary evil, but not a great sweeper. Sure, it'll wipe the board a decent amount of the time, but it's so far behind the other sweepers in white and black. The fact that it hits your own creatures and planeswalkers means that it's really hard to come away from the sweeper on top, and your opponent will likely get the first crack at taking advantage of the clear board. Hopefully, Meteor Swarm can fill the role well enough that we don't need to bring Storm's Wrath back. Den of the Bugbear is one of 2 new creature lands that we're testing out with this update. These lands are in a strange place since the opportunity cost is so low to include them. However, they come in tapped quite often, and most of the good lands in the cycle belong in aggro decks that suffer the most from having a tapped land. Den of the Bugbear has pretty high upside, however, even if we're not likely to see it come up that often. Turning a land into a must-kill threat is always big game, and more decks could stand to pick up playable utility lands. We weren't originally going to test it, but we asked if we had any mediocre cards we wouldn't hate to lose, and we agreed that Flame Spill fits that description. As a removal spell, it's weaker than most of the 2-mana red burn spells, and it's easy to have cards like Flame Spill clogging your 3-drop slot. Mizzix's Mastery kind of came out of left field with the Strixhaven Mystical Archive. As an old commander card that hasn't had a standard printing, I think it caught people off guard just how powerful of an effect it has. 8 mana to flash back all of the spells in your graveyard is game-winning, to say the least, and this even has a fallback mode of being a 4-mana copy of any single instant or sorcery in your graveyard if you need it to be. It pulls double duty here for us as well. For one, it fits perfectly into the theoretical Drakehaven deck we're trying to support, since that deck can easily dump spells in the graveyard. Second, it's an easy replacement for Increasing Vengeance, another archive card that fell a bit flat. We've always had a flex slot for this sort of spell manipulation effect, and we believe Mizzix's Mastery might be the best one yet. Alright, closing out Red, I'm going to have to defer any real comments about Sark in the Master List to Chris. I'm not a big fan of the card, even though it does have its merit against aggro decks. The passive ability shuts X1s off if the opponent doesn't have a way to clear the dragon token or the planeswalker itself, but my experience with the card is that slaying the dragon isn't usually that hard of a feat. Chris wants to bring Sarkin back, so we're giving him a second run. I'm not keen on the card, but we're basically reversing the swap we made to bring in Ox of Agonis. Honestly, Ox hasn't had any real window for testing, but it's felt a little out of place in the few drafts it's shown up in. Turns out we won't be talking about a big flashy mythic rare dragon for green, since the one we got isn't nearly up to snuff. Sorry, old Gnawbone. Instead, we'll start off with a creature I'm advocating for heavily. I seem to like Werewolf Pack Leader significantly more than others, and having played the limited format quite a bit at this point, it seems fairly easy to turn on Pack Tactics in a deck looking to do so. With Pack Tactics, this is a 2-mana 3/3 that draws a card on attacks, even if it won't be drawing that card until at least turn 4 most of the time. There are two concerns though, the first being the double green casting cost. Naturally, this means you won't always land the werewolf on turn 2, but I think it'll happen more often than not. Second, green aggro decks aren't heavily supported. I think they could use more support personally, and cards like this go a long way towards making that happen. I think it'll help green decks play out a little less linearly as ramp decks if we spot a few beatdown pieces for the Gruul decks. At any rate, whether the werewolf ends up being a miss or not, we don't need to hold on to Wildborn Preserver for any reason. It's a fine creature with some potentially high upside, but in the same vein as the werewolf, it's a bit off theme for a lot of green decks. Ranger class is another limited bomb that has a huge question mark next to it as far as cube is concerned. Unlike most of the classes, Ranger class spots you a creature up front and has a natural progression of casting it on turn 2 and leveling it up on turn 3. Once you hit level 2, you can put some real pressure on the opponent, but you do have to invest a few turns into making that happen, and it's unclear whether that'll be worth the effort. Level 3 is a fantastic mana sink and card advantage tool all in one, but we're talking about having invested 8 mana before you get the privilege of casting creatures from the top of your deck. The power is certainly there, it's just a matter of whether or not green decks have enough time and mana to get to that point. Guess we'll have to try it out and see, huh? Removing Scavenging Ooze felt like a good call for the time being. Scavenging Ooze is a fantastic card that more or less hoses graveyard strategies, which I've already mentioned as something we're not interested in at the moment. Scooze will have its time and place in the future, I'm sure, but at present it's more harmful than good. We're picking up the green creature land from the set as well, Lair of the Hydra. Again, these lands are pretty safe in terms of their effect on your mana base, and the upside is certainly there. Of all the colors, green tends to be the color that both produces the most mana and also has the most mana laying around with nothing to spend it on. Being able to dump that mana into a land to produce a sizable attacker or blocker, all at the cost of replacing a forest with a land that sometimes comes in tapped, feels like a no-brainer. It takes less setup than its sister land Crawling Barrens and produces colored mana, which is significant upside to any utility land. It'll be taking the place of Kazandu Mammoth, an MDFC with a lackluster front half. We've mentioned already that green beatdown decks don't quite make the cut, and while I'm actively pushing to change that, green has much better options in the 3-drop slot for this style of deck. The Gearhulk is back. Look, Virda's Gearhulk was never bad, quite the opposite, but we want to give new cards their due diligence when we think they have a shot, as was the case with the Gearhulk's replacement, Battle Mammoth. And honestly, Battle Mammoth's not bad either, it's just not as good as most of green's other 5-drops. I never felt bad about submitting a deck with Battle Mammoth in it, but it's definitely a tier 2 threat at best. Foretell doesn't add as much as you'd think to the card, since green decks always have something to do on turn 2, and you always want to play your mana dork when you can. It was a perfectly fine showing for the Mammoth, but Verdurous is a tried and true beater, and you can't deny the sheer stats it puts on the table. Well, welcome back, friend. We're trying out something a little new with green this time around, and the new edition of Elvish Reclaimer should key you off as to what that is. We're looking to incorporate a small Lands Matters package into green, or more specifically into Golgari, to give the color pair a little bit more flavor and direction, since Full-On Reanimator doesn't have the support it needs. Reclaimer is the first addition in this package, as a card that can fix your mana, fetch out specific utility lands, put lands in the graveyard for some of the other additions we'll mention shortly, and beat down once you've hit enough lands in the yard. Again, this is all a bit speculative, but if the Lands Matters deck exists, expect Elvish Reclaimer to be one of the pivotal pieces. We're removing our first Strixhaven Mystical Archive card here. The card in question is Primal Command, a green spell with a bit of a pedigree in older cubes. Our hopes were high given that Primal Command is a classic green spell, but it hasn't felt great to actually cast it. It seems that green's creatures are impactful enough that you should just be casting them instead of spending a turn to fetch one up for the next turn. The disruptive elements of the card rarely come up, and while 7 life is a pretty substantial buffer to pair with the creature tutor ability, it only does so much against aggro decks. This is just a case of a classic card not having the same impact in our cube as it's traditionally had in others. After seeing Elvish Reclaimer, you're probably expecting to see Ramunap Excavator. The two play perfectly together, even if Ramunap Excavator doesn't do much outside of this intended archetype. Even so, being able to sacrifice or cycle lands for value and then immediately play them from the graveyard is a form of card advantage in its own right, and the Excavator helps fuel the type of lands matters deck that we're trying to support here. To make room, we felt like we could safely remove Reclamation Sage. Artifacts and enchantments aren't running rampant in the cube, and there are much stronger versions of Reclamation Sage at higher rarities, cards like Gemraiser and Knight of Autumn, among others. Polaka Worm will make an appearance in the Unrestricted Cube, even if it's a short-lived one. It's expensive at 7 mana, but it does a phenomenal job at stabilizing against aggressive decks, and only one player gets to pick up Hornet Queen if it's opened at all. It felt like a fine time to introduce another stabilizing green threat worth ramping into, and while Polaka Worm isn't as powerful as the other options we're already playing, it'll still get the job done. Collected Company got the axe here. It was a standard powerhouse, but we feared it might not be consistent enough for Cube. After trying it out numerous times, it seems our fears were right, and Collected Company was just taking up space for a very niche deck. Finally, this update will see green picking up Explore over Dragon's Guard Elite. Explore is a pretty inoffensive option for any green deck to have. We've noticed how often an 8-person pod will produce multiple green ramp drafters, and it's felt like we could stand to spot them another mana dork of some sort. We weren't satisfied with the options available to us, so we landed on Explore as a card that has the same goal of ramping while playing double duty with some of the Lands Matters cards we're bringing in. Back to Dragon's Guard Elite, well, let's just say there's not really a home for it. Magecraft on a green beatdown creature is a bit of a stretch, which we recognized when we brought it in. Turns out there are basically no decks interested in picking up the Elite, and it's pretty obvious now that it's a man without a country here. Kicking off our multicolor and colorless section, we have perhaps the most difficult card in the entire update for me to discuss. Orcus, Prince of Undeath, has already gotten its fair share of press, with most people landing on the card being a bit worse than other Rakdos options that already exist. I'm not so sure about that. I've heard people say that a 5/3 flyer for 4 doesn't cut it these days, but doesn't it? At 4 mana, a 5-power evasive beater is a great top-end threat to close out a game, and Orcus is so much more than that. It's very difficult to parse out what Orcus can do, though. He's essentially got 2 different kicker abilities with an X variable for either mode, and the second mode requires you to make even more choices. That's a lot of choice and function from a card that already holds its own as a threat. Orcus is fantastic when you're ahead, that's pretty obvious from its stat line, but the reanimation mode letting you bring back a small creature or 2 with haste can close the game out quickly. And if you're behind, those creatures can stay on defense, not to mention you can use the first mode to sweep little creatures off the board like a Painful Massacre Worm. There's a lot going on here, and it's unclear whether Orcus has what it takes to make it long term, but we're testing it and I'm hoping to be impressed. All that said, we made the choice because we wanted to ditch Cut to Ribbons, and that freed up a Rakdos slot anyway. I've already alluded to this next inclusion a couple times, but the Gitrog monster is making a debut for the cube in the hopes that it signals a green-black Lands Matters archetype of sorts. It'll probably need a bit more support over coming updates, but the Gitrog is already enough of a powerhouse that we're hoping players will take it and actively seek out ways to make the archetype come together. Just to clarify, we're not completely abandoning Golgari's identity as a graveyard reanimation style deck. Rather, we've recognized that the style of deck isn't fully supported on Arena, and we want to give Golgari a bit more definition and flavor for the time being. Underrealm Lich was a direct swap for the Frog, ironic given that the Lich is capable of churning through your deck and filling the graveyard, but it's not a card our players have been drafting, and it's pretty poorly positioned against the aggro menace at the moment. Simics getting an interesting test card in Volo Guide to Monsters. Volo has an incredibly powerful text box that scales to the power of your cube, even if achieving the trigger can be a bit finicky. The fact that Volo himself is a human and a wizard knocks out some percentage of possible triggers, not to mention that Volo doesn't work favorably with most legendary creatures. Still, it only takes curving Volo into an Elder Gargaroth or Verdur's Gearhulk to win the game. I'm a big fan of cards that are fun to build around and ask you to make consciously different picks than you otherwise normally would, so I'm excited to see how it all pans out. That being said, Vo is a bit of a cute addition, and we already have Vannifar occupying that play space. It only made sense to swap the two in order to avoid overloading on narrow build-arounds in the Simic section. Sometimes we like to sit back and listen to what our Discord admin team tells us, and what admin Theo has been telling us for a while now is that expressive iteration is too powerful not to be playing. Honestly, after seeing the card in action, I'm inclined to agree. It's an incredibly powerful draw spell that works at nearly any stage of the game from turn 3 onwards. It can help find a land drop on turn 3 while also replacing itself, and in the mid to late game it's very often a 2-mana draw 2 with card selection attached. It also happens to slot perfectly into the tempo spell-based decks that Izzet has been leaning towards these days. It's a pretty easy swap for Goblin Electromancer, which was a fine role player. I wasn't on board with testing Electromancer, but I was pleasantly surprised to find out that it does enough in Izzet decks that I wouldn't be embarrassed to play it. True as that may be, Izzet decks still operate just fine without it, and Expressive Iteration will likely be a more desirable card for a wider range of Izzet decks. The Royal Scions are back for another spin, and while they weren't exceptional last time they were around, a few things have changed to make us suspect they're worth a second look. First off, the Drakehaven package is hungry for as many looting effects as possible, so the card filtering aspect of the Royal Scions is already better than it was previously. Second is it has had a bit of a tonal shift away from a third-rate control deck, moving towards a tempo spell-based deck. With the focus more on efficient threats like Sprite Dragon and Friends, the stat boosting ability of the Scions becomes more appealing as a way to just push in damage. It's more of a Chris card than something I'm jazzed about, but I'm fully behind trying it out in a new light. We trimmed Electrolyze here. Electrolyze and Prismari Command both entered the cube at the same time and occupied much the same territory, so the plan was always to test both out and see which one felt better, and the award has fallen squarely with Prismari Command. Electrolyze isn't bad by any means, it's just the lesser of the two similar powerful spells. I've always been a big fan of the small 3-color gold section in the cube, and while the individual cards have moved around quite a bit, I'm always excited to try out another splashy gold spell. This time that spell will be Muldrotha the Gravetide, a value graveyard creature that seems like it should supplement the Lands Matters archetype fairly well. It might be a bit too expensive and cumbersome to warrant long-term inclusion, but we see an opportunity to try out a card that otherwise might not get a chance to shine. Also, who can really pass up on an iconic Dominaria card? As far as cuts go, we're removing Nethroi, which we originally included as a different tie-in to graveyard-based decks. I've seen it mutated once and it looked quite good, plus a 5/5 lifelinker is nothing to scoff at, but the rate at which it gets drafted is abysmal. It's got potential, but if no one's going to play it, it's got to go. We've got a little bit of cleanup going on in the colorless section this time around. We're still pretty unsatisfied with the overall quality of colorless cards on Arena, so most of these changes are simply ways to remove the chaff from our colorless section and see if something new has merit instead. Hand of Vecna doesn't necessarily scream cube staple, but we're confident it's better than Helm of the Host at this point. Helm was in our original iteration of the cube, and it was pretty fun to see people go off with another Dominaria powerhouse. However, as the cube got more streamlined and archetypes became more focused, cute one-offs like Helm of the Host dropped out of favor, enough so that it's probably a mistake to even put the card in your deck. Truthfully, Hand of Vecna might not be much better, but it seems like a playable tool for aggro decks looking to go over the top of giant blockers. You can swing for some serious damage as early as turn 3 with the right draws, although the equipment loses some points for doing literal nothing on defense. It's not here to stay, but when you're scrapping for good playable colorless cards, you need to try out some things you normally wouldn't. Cosmos Elixir falls into the same category, a colorless card that's not likely to be good enough, but has the potential to be a sleeper. Persistent life gain against aggro and a one-sided Howling Mine against control seems like a respectable range of effects on a 4-mana artifact, and we can imagine games where Cosmos Elixir pulls its weight. What decks are actually interested in picking it up and playing it remains to be seen, but there's potential here. We're actually cutting one of our better artifacts here in Sword of Body and Mind, not because it's bad, but because it's just a completely binary magic card with two wildly different outcomes. Either you're against a deck where the protection doesn't matter and it's dead average, or you're against a blue-green deck and it single-handedly shuts them out of the game. Neither are very fun outcomes, and while I'll be the first to admit that it's not as overwhelmingly oppressive as I made it out to be, we're all in agreement that it just leads to unfun and uninteractive play patterns. Perilous Mirror is an innocuous little card, but it plays well in a number of different decks, from aggro to aristocrats, while also being a pretty potent tool against aggro. Will Perilous Mirror completely change the landscape of the Unrestricted Cube? Yeah, probably not, but it's got a role to play here nonetheless. Just like Helm of the Host, Traxos is another Dominaria casualty that's been hiding in the background since the start of the cube. Look, there are decks where Traxos is theoretically good, especially given the increase in number of sagas and legendaries we get these days, but in decks where it would be good, you have 4-drops that do just as much, if not more, and don't have the occasional drawback of staying tapped for a turn or two. Look, Karn's Sign of Urza kinda sucks, and I made a big deal about it when we removed it from the cube last time. Call me a hypocrite if you will, but we're bringing it back because Untethered Express sucks even more, and at least Karn does something in decks that are scrapping for some sort of card advantage. Until we get better artifacts, Karn will never be an all-star card for the cube, but it's a card we've seen people play often, for better or worse, and players tend to like it. It's worth bringing it in over the Pain Train, which is heavily outclassed by all the big flying vehicles like Sky Sovereign and Heart of Kiran. Crucible of Worlds is a highly specific tool for this sort of cube, but there's some design space for cards like this. That is, if we want the Lands Matters deck to work, we're willing to use some flex spots to support it as fully as possible. Similar to Ramanop Excavator, we're talking about cards that only one deck would want. That goes against our design philosophies to some extent, but also allows the intended archetype to breathe a little bit, since a player drafting Golgari lands shouldn't have to fight over its key pieces. Also remember that our cube is at 450 cards, so not every card gets opened, and having a redundant copy of this effect makes it that much more likely that the player needing it will see it in the draft. It's coming in over Wandering Archaic, a colorless creature that came in for much the same reasons some of the cards we're talking about right now came in. Archaic's not good, never really was, and clearly doesn't offer any real solutions to our colorless problem, which frees up a spot for us to try out Crucible. And finally, we have a small sweeping change to our land section, with all of the remaining pathways coming in over all of the remaining temples. Our original philosophy was to give temples to the color pairs that tend to play slower and could afford to play a tapped utility land. However, we're happy with how the pathways have been playing out, and it seems like it's in our best interest to homogenize the color pairs with a pathway in each section. They do a great job of making sure you get to play the game and get on board early, and the advantage of playing temples has always been marginal at best. Alright folks, this has been a long one, but we made it to the end. If you're here, thanks for hanging out, and remember that you can come draft with us on Wednesday nights if you want to try out these changes for yourself. Links to our Discord server are in the description below, where you can offer feedback, suggestions, and just talk about the new set and cube in general. Our community is full of genuinely friendly and awesome people, so come check it out. With all that being said, remember to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. Be on the lookout for our Peasant update in the near future. My name's Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time.